The rain came down in sheets that November afternoon, turning the streets of Ashford, Massachusetts into rivers of fallen leaves and forgotten memories. Detective Sarah Brennan stood outside the colonial-style house on Maple Ridge Road, her hand trembling slightly as she held the warrant. 18 years. 18 years of dead ends, false leads, and nights spent staring at case files until the words blurred together. And now, finally, the name on this piece of paper. Zoe Mitchell. The name felt wrong in her mouth, like swallowing glass. Zoe Mitchell, who ran the community garden on 4th Street. Zoe Mitchell, who organized the annual Christmas toy drive. Zoe Mitchell, whose homemade apple pies won the county fair 3 years running. Zoe Mitchell, who every single person in Ashford would describe as the kindest soul they'd ever met. Zoe Mitchell, who in 2007 allegedly murdered 17-year-old Amanda Chen in the woods behind Riverside High School. Sarah's partner, Detective Marcus Liu, stood beside her, his jaw set in that way it always did when a case was about to crack wide open. He'd been on the force for 23 years, had seen everything twice, and even he looked unsettled. Behind them, 3 patrol cars idled quietly, their lights off. Chief Reynolds had insisted on discretion. The last thing Ashford needed was a media circus before they had her in custody. "You ready?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the drumming rain. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for this. She thought of the crime scene photos she'd studied 1,000 times. Amanda Chen, honors student, violin prodigy, found with her throat slashed in a shallow grave near the old oak tree everyone called the witness tree. The case had consumed the town, turned neighbor against neighbor, destroyed families with suspicion and grief. Amanda's parents had moved away in 2010, unable to bear another day in the place where their daughter had been stolen from them. And now, this. They walked up the flagstone path. Zoe's garden, even in late autumn, showed signs of meticulous care. The last chrysanthemums of the season bloomed in burgundy and gold, their petals heavy with rain. A small ceramic sign near the door read, "All are welcome here." Sarah felt something twist in her chest. Marcus knocked, 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo in the gray afternoon. The door opened almost immediately, as if she'd been expecting them. Zoe Mitchell stood in the doorway, 52 years old, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a loose bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. She wore a flour-dusted apron over jeans and a cardigan. The smell of baking bread wafted out from behind her, warm and yeasty, and utterly incongruous with the moment. "Detectives," she said, and her voice held no surprise, no fear, just a quiet, terrible resignation that made Sarah's stomach drop. "I wondered when you'd come." Sarah forced herself to speak, to follow the protocol she'd practiced 1,000 times in her mind. "Zoe Mitchell, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the murder of Amanda Chen on October 14, 2007. You have the right to remain silent." As Sarah read her rights, Zoe simply stood there, her hands clasped in front of her apron. She didn't interrupt, didn't protest. When Sarah finished, Zoe turned back into her house and called out, "Daniel, could you come here, please?" A moment later, a tall man, late 20s, with Zoe's same gentle eyes appeared. Her son. Sarah had researched the family. Daniel Mitchell, elementary school teacher, married 2 years ago to a woman named Claire who taught art at the middle school. "Mom?" Daniel's face went white as he saw the detectives, the warrant in Sarah's hand. "I need you to call Miriam Goldstein," referring to the best criminal defense attorney in the county. "And I need you to take the bread out of the oven in 20 minutes. Don't let it burn." "Mom, what is this?" Daniel's voice cracked. Zoe reached up and touched his face with one hand, a gesture so tender that Sarah had to look away. "I love you," Zoe said. "Remember that. No matter what you hear, remember that I love you. that I've always loved you." "Zoe Mitchell, we need you to come with us now," Marcus said, his voice professional but not unkind. Zoe nodded. She removed her apron, folded it carefully, and set it on the hall table. Then she held out her wrists. As Marcus moved to handcuff her, Sarah noticed something, a small tattoo on Zoe's inner left wrist, a violet, the flower of faithfulness and remembrance. Later, Sarah would learn that Amanda Chen had worn a violet pendant the day she died, a gift from her grandmother. The pendant had never been found. They led Zoe to the patrol car. By now, despite the chief's efforts, neighbors had begun to emerge. Old Mrs. Patterson from next door, hands pressed to her mouth. Tom Reeves from across the street, setting down his rake in slow motion, his face a mask of disbelief. A teenage girl, Sarah recognized as one of the students from the high school, stood frozen on the sidewalk, her phone out, already filming. Before they helped Zoe into the car, she turned and looked back at her house. At Daniel, who stood in the doorway like a man watching his world collapse. At the garden she'd tended for 2 decades. At the small town she'd called home for 30 years. "It was never supposed to be like this," she said, so quietly that only Sarah heard her. Sarah thought she was talking about the arrest. Later, she'd realize Zoe meant something else entirely. The Ashford police station, a brick building that had stood since 1952, erupted into controlled chaos the moment they brought Zoe through the doors. Officers who'd known her for years, who'd eaten at her table during the annual precinct barbecue, whose kids she'd taught to plant tomatoes, stopped and stared. Some looked angry, some looked confused. Chief Reynolds, a broad-shouldered man of 60 with more gray than black in his hair, met them in the corridor. "Interview room 3, he said tersely. Then to Zoe, in a voice that struggled to remain neutral, "I never thought... Zoe, what the hell is going on?" "I'd like my lawyer present," Zoe replied, her voice still calm, still measured, as if she were discussing the weather rather than a murder charge that would likely put her away for life. They processed her in silence. Fingerprints, photographs, personal effects itemized and bagged. Through it all, Zoe remained composed, answering questions with yes or no when necessary, offering nothing more. Sarah watched from the observation room, trying to reconcile the woman in the orange jumpsuit with the woman who'd helped her plant a memorial garden for her late mother just 2 years ago. Miriam Goldstein arrived within the hour, a woman of 65 with steel gray hair and a reputation for being ruthless in court and compassionate with her clients. She disappeared into the interview room with Zoe, and when she emerged 30 minutes later, her face was unreadable. "My client will make a statement," Miriam announced, "but only to you, Detective Brennan, no one else, and she wants it recorded." Sarah exchanged glances with Marcus. This was irregular, but not impossible. "Why me?" "She says you'll understand." 20 minutes later, Sarah sat across from Zoe Mitchell in a gray room that smelled of stale coffee and old desperation. The camera in the corner blinked red. Miriam sat beside her client, a yellow legal pad open in front of her. And Zoe, hands folded on the metal table, began to speak. "I need to start by saying that I did not kill Amanda Chen, but I know who did. I've always known who did, and I have spent 18 years protecting him." Sarah's pen froze over her notebook. "Who?" "My son," Zoe said, and her voice finally cracked. "Daniel killed Amanda Chen. He was 14 years old, and he killed her, and I've been covering for him ever since." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process this new information, to fit it into the narrative they'd constructed. The evidence, new DNA evidence that had just been processed using updated technology, had matched Zoe's profile. Not perfectly, but close enough to warrant an arrest. A familial match. "You're telling me your son committed this murder when he was 14 and you covered it up?" Sarah's voice was sharper than she intended. "I'm telling you that I found my son covered in blood in our backyard that night. I'm telling you that he was holding a knife and crying, and when I asked him what happened, he said, 'She's dead, Mom. Oh God, she's dead.' I'm telling you that I made a choice in that moment that I've regretted every day since. But I made it, and I can't unmake it." Miriam touched Zoe's arm gently. Zoe took a shaky breath and continued. "Daniel had a crush on Amanda. Everyone knew it. She was everything he wasn't: popular, confident, brilliant. He followed her around like a puppy. Most of the time she ignored him. Sometimes, when her friends weren't watching, she was kind to him. Those moments meant everything to Daniel. He was a lonely kid, bullied, awkward, and Amanda represented something he could never have." Sarah thought of the Daniel she'd seen today, the gentleman who taught third graders, who'd looked at his mother with such confusion and love. Could that man have been a killer at 14? "That day," Zoe continued, "October 14th, 2007, Amanda had agreed to meet him. She'd been kind. She'd said she'd help him with his math homework. She tutored sometimes, made extra money that way. They were supposed to meet at the library, but Daniel said he wanted to show her something in the woods first. The witness tree. He'd carved their initials there, or something equally stupid and adolescent. He wanted to impress her." Zoe paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "But when they agreed to meet him because she felt sorry for him, and Daniel, something broke in Daniel. He'd brought a knife. He'd been whittling, making her something, some kind of gift. And when she laughed, he stabbed her. He said it was like watching someone else do it, like he was outside his body, and when he came back to himself, she was on the ground and there was so much blood." The room felt suffocating. Sarah forced herself to keep writing, to capture every word. "He ran home. He threw up in the bushes. He was shaking so hard I thought he was having a seizure, and Zoe's voice broke completely. "I cleaned him up. I burned his clothes in our fireplace. I put the knife in a bag and drove it 3 towns over and threw it in a dumpster behind a grocery store. I made him shower until his skin was raw. And then I held him while he cried and told him we would never speak of this again." Sarah looked up. "And the body? How did you—" "I didn't move her," Zoe said quickly. "I couldn't. I wasn't even sure exactly where she was. Daniel was incoherent, could barely describe the location. I thought, God help me, I thought maybe it would look like a random attack. Maybe they'd never connect it to Daniel. He had an alibi. He was supposed to be at a friend's house, and the friend covered for him thought Daniel was just trying to sneak out to see a girl. The friend's mother confirmed he'd been there all evening. No one suspected Daniel. No one even questioned him, except in passing as part of the general investigation of everyone who knew Amanda. Until now," Sarah said. "Until we ran the familial DNA match." She nodded. "I knew when they found that hair at the scene. They mentioned it in the news, said they were going to retest evidence with new technology. I knew it was only a matter of time. The hair was mine. I'd been at that location before, months earlier, on a school field trip. I'd chaperoned Daniel's 8th grade class on a nature walk. We'd passed right by the witness tree. Some of my hair must have transferred to the area, or maybe I'd touched the tree, I don't know. But when your results came back showing a family connection, you looked at me instead of him." Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. "You're confessing to covering up a murder to protect your son. You understand that's obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and a dozen other charges." "I understand," Zoe said. "I've always understood. I've lived every single day knowing it would come. Why now? Why tell us now? You could have maintained your innocence, fought the DNA evidence, claimed contamination." Zoe met her eyes,
and in them, Sarah saw something she hadn't expected. Relief. "Because I'm tired," Zoe said simply. "I'm tired of lying. I'm tired of watching my son live half a life, always looking over his shoulder, always one wrong word away from confession. I'm tired of Amanda's parents never knowing what happened to their daughter. I'm tired of being the kind person, the helpful person, the good person, when I know what I really am, what I've really done." She leaned forward, her hands still folded. "And because Daniel has a daughter now, Lily. She's 6 months old, and every time I look at her, I think about Amanda Chen. I think about the life she never got to live, the children she never got to have, and I think about Lily growing up with a grandmother who's a liar and a criminal, and a father who's a murderer. And I can't do it anymore. I can't let another generation be built on this lie." Sarah felt something crack in her chest. She thought of her own daughter, away at college, full of life and possibility. She thought of Amanda Chen, forever 17. "Where is Daniel now?" Sarah asked. "Home, where you left him. He doesn't know I'm telling you this. He thinks—" "He spent 18 years thinking I did it, that I killed Amanda. I never told him I knew. I let him think I'd murdered her to protect him from some imagined threat or in some moment of rage. I let him carry that guilt, the guilt of believing his mother was a killer because of him, rather than the guilt of being a killer himself." The logic was twisted, heartbreaking, and somehow made perfect sense. She could see the calculation Zoe had made. Better for Daniel to think himself indirectly responsible than directly guilty. Better for him to believe his mother had driven him to murder than to believe he had committed murder himself. "We'll need to bring him in," Sarah said. "I know. But Detective Brennan, when you do, please remember that he was 14 years old. Please remember that he spent half his life trying to make up for something he doesn't even consciously remember doing. He became a teacher. He helps children. He's kind. He's good. What happened that day, it doesn't define who he became." Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't, because the law didn't care about redemption. The law cared about justice, and justice, after 18 years, was finally coming to Ashford. As they led Zoe back to her cell, Sarah remained in the interview room staring at her notes. The camera was still recording, the red light blinking steadily. She thought about the bread baking in Zoe's oven, probably burnt by now. She thought about Daniel Mitchell standing in his doorway watching his mother being taken away. She thought about Amanda Chen's parents, where they were now, about to receive a phone call that would reopen every wound they'd spent years trying to heal. And she thought about the witness tree, standing in the woods behind Riverside High School, keeping its secrets until technology finally made it speak.
Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained dark. It was 4:47 p.m. on November 12, 2025, and in Ashford, Massachusetts, nothing would ever be the same again. The story of Zoe Mitchell, the kind woman who'd hidden a terrible truth, was just beginning to unfold. And in the hours and days to come, the town would have to reckon with the question that had no easy answer. What do you do when the person you thought you knew turns out to be someone else entirely? What do you do when kindness and monstrosity live in the same heart? Before the arrest, before the confession, before everything fell apart, there was simply Zoe. Zoe Mitchell woke every morning at 5:30 a.m., even on Sundays. It was a habit she'd developed years ago, born from necessity rather than choice. When Daniel was young, those early morning hours were the only time she had to herself, time to think, to breathe, to be someone other than Mom. Now, decades later, the habit remained, carved into her body like a scar.
She would sit at her kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and watch the sunrise over Ashford. The kitchen faced east, and she'd chosen this house partly for that reason. The morning light streaming through the windows, turning everything golden. In those quiet moments, before the town woke, before she had to be the person everyone expected, Zoe would allow herself to remember. Not Amanda. Never Amanda. Not if she could help it. Those memories lived in a locked box in her mind, one she only opened when sleep deprivation or stress made her careless. Now, in the mornings, Zoe remembered her mother. Eleanor Morgan had died when Zoe was 19, too young to lose a mother, too old to be orphaned in any meaningful way. Eleanor had been a kindergarten teacher, a woman who believed in second chances and the fundamental goodness of children. "People aren't born bad, Zoe," she used to say. "They're made bad by circumstances, by pain, by fear. Our job is to see past the behavior to the child underneath." Zoe had carried those words with her for 33 years. She tried to live by them. When she'd found Daniel that night, covered in blood and shaking, those words had echoed in her mind like a prayer. "He's not bad. He's not bad. This is circumstance. This is pain. This is fear. He's still my boy underneath." The question she never allowed herself to ask, even in those quiet morning hours, was whether her mother would have understood the choice she'd made, whether Eleanor would have forgiven her, whether forgiveness was even possible for what she'd done. By 6 a.m., Zoe would be dressed, usually jeans and a sweater, comfortable shoes, hair pulled back. She'd pack a lunch, sandwich, apple, thermos of soup in winter. She'd kiss the photo of her late husband, James, that sat on the mantel. He'd died of a heart attack in 2013, 8 years after the worst night of their lives, never knowing the truth. Zoe had carried the secret alone, adding James's memory to the list of things she couldn't let herself think about too deeply. The community garden opened at 7 a.m., though Zoe usually arrived by 6:30. She had a key, of course. She'd been the garden's coordinator since 2009, when the town had transformed an empty lot on 4th Street into a green space where anyone could plant, tend, and harvest. The garden had been Zoe's idea, her proposal to the town council, her way of giving back to a community that never suspected her of anything worse than being too generous with her time. And it had worked. The garden thrived. In summer, tomatoes grew heavy on their vines, zucchini multiplied like rabbits, sunflowers towered over everything like benevolent giants. In autumn, pumpkins swelled, and apples hung from the small orchard they'd planted in year 2. Even in winter, the greenhouse produced lettuce, herbs, kale that seemed to taste better for the frost. Zoe knew every inch of that garden. She knew which plot belonged to Mrs. Ramesh, who grew curry leaves and okra, and taught her to make proper chai. She knew where Michael Torres, the high school physics teacher, grew his prize-winning peppers, habaneros so hot they'd made 3 grown men cry. She knew that in plot 17, Lucy Chen sometimes came to plant pansies. Lucy Chen, Amanda's aunt, her father's younger sister. Lucy had moved to Ashford in 2015, taking a job at the hospital as a nurse practitioner, either not knowing or not caring that this was the town where her niece had died. Zoe had recognized her immediately. She had Amanda's eyes, that same deep brown that seemed to see everything. But Lucy had never made the connection, had never known that the kind woman who'd helped her stake tomatoes and choose perennials was connected to her family's tragedy. Every conversation with Lucy was an exquisite pain. Lucy would talk about her work, about the patients she'd saved, about her hope to start a scholarship fund in Amanda's name. And Zoe would listen, would offer encouragement, would sometimes bring Lucy fresh basil or a bag of green beans, all the while dying inside. "You're so kind," Lucy had said once, back in 2016, after Zoe had helped her plant a memorial rose bush. Pink roses, Amanda's favorite. "My family went through something horrible, and I used to think the world was full of terrible people. But then I meet someone like you, and I remember that there's still good in the world." Zoe had gone home that day and vomited until there was nothing left inside her. But she kept going back to the garden, because what else could she do? Quit? Move away? Those would have been admissions of guilt in their own way, breaks in the pattern that might draw attention. So she stayed. She smiled. She taught children how to plant seeds and watch them grow. She organized harvest festivals and composting workshops. She became, year by year, exactly the person everyone thought she was, except in the moments when she was alone.
Her ass, and moved on. Zoe had gone home and sat in her darkened living room for 6 hours, unable to move, unable to think, barely able to breathe. It was Daniel's wedding day in 2023, standing beside him as he married Claire, watching him smile with uncomplicated joy and thinking, he doesn't remember. He's buried it so deep that he truly doesn't remember. And in that moment, Zoe had felt something she couldn't name. Relief, mixed with horror, mixed with grief so profound it felt like drowning. It was holding baby Lily for the first time, that tiny, perfect human who smelled like milk and powder and new beginnings, and thinking, Amanda never got to do this. Amanda never got to hold her child, never got to be a mother, never got to know this fierce, consuming love. It was all the small moments, accumulating like snow, until the weight of them threatened to bury her alive. Zoe had tried over the years to be good, not just to seem good, but to actually be good, as if enough good deeds could somehow balance the scales. She volunteered at the library, reading to children every Thursday afternoon. She donated generously to every charity that asked, often anonymously. She served on the town council for 2 terms, focusing on youth programs and addiction services. She was the person people called when they needed help. A ride to the hospital, someone to watch their kids, a meal after a funeral. And it had worked, in a way. Zoe had constructed a life that looked perfect from the outside. But inside, she was a house of cards, always one strong wind away from collapse. Her relationship with Daniel was the most complicated thread in her web of lies. After James died, Daniel had been her rock, calling every day, visiting twice a week, making sure she was eating and sleeping and not drowning in grief. He'd been so attentive, so caring, and Zoe had wanted to scream at him, "Don't you understand? Don't you remember what you did, what I did for you?" But of course, he didn't. Or if he did, he'd locked it away so thoroughly that it might as well have never happened. And Zoe had let him, had encouraged it even, because what would be the point of dragging it all back up, of making him face what he'd done as a child? Except now there was Lily, and the lie had a new generation to contaminate. I remember the day Daniel and Claire had told me about the pregnancy. They'd come to Sunday dinner, as they did most weeks, and Daniel had been practically vibrating with excitement. "Mom," he said, taking my hand, "we have news. You're going to be a grandmother." I cried, which they interpreted as joy, and some of it was joy, genuine, uncomplicated happiness at the idea of a grandchild. But mostly I cried because I thought, another person who'll grow up built on a lie, another person who'll have to live in this poisoned world I've created.
When Lily was born in May 2025, Zoe had held her in the hospital and made a silent promise. You deserve better. You deserve a family built on truth, not secrets. You deserve to know who you come from, even if it's painful. It was that promise, more than anything, that had sealed her fate. Because Zoe knew that truth was coming, whether she wanted it or not. The news about familial DNA testing had been everywhere in 2024. Cold cases being solved decades later, family members being tracked down through genetic genealogy. It was only a matter of time before someone decided to run Amanda's evidence through the new databases. When the news broke in October 2025 that the Ashford Police Department was partnering with a genetic genealogy company to test old evidence, Zoe had known her time was up. She'd sat in her kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and thought, "This is it. This is how it ends." Part of her had felt relief. The secret had been a physical weight she'd carried for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The idea of finally putting it down, of finally telling someone, anyone, the truth was almost intoxicating. But another part of her was terrified. Not for herself. She'd accepted long ago that she deserved whatever punishment came her way. No, she was terrified for Daniel, for Claire, for Lily, for the life they'd built that was about to be demolished. In the weeks before her arrest, Zoe had tried to prepare, though she wasn't sure what she was preparing for. She'd organized her files, paid her bills ahead, updated her will. She'd written letters to Daniel, to Claire, to Patricia, to Lucy Chen, to the other gardeners, to everyone she'd lied to for 18 years. She'd sealed the letters in envelopes and hidden them in her desk drawer, unsure if she'd ever have the courage to send them. She'd gone to the witness tree one last time, in late October, when the leaves were at their peak and the woods were a riot of red and gold. She'd stood there in the place where Amanda had died, and she'd tried to say something, an apology, a prayer, an explanation. But no words came. What could she possibly say that would matter? She'd noticed then that someone had carved new initials into the tree, dozens of them accumulated over the years, teenagers in love, marking their territory, claiming their moment of immortality. The tree was a palimpsest of young lives, all of them unknowingly circling the place where another young life had ended. Zoe had touched the bark, rough under her fingers, and thought, "You've kept this secret for so long, but secrets can't last forever. Everything comes out eventually." The tree didn't answer. Trees never did. But Zoe felt somehow that it understood. On the morning of November 12, 2025, Zoe had woken with a strange clarity. She'd known, with absolute certainty, that this was the day. She couldn't have explained how she knew, maybe some sixth sense, or maybe just the cumulative weight of 18 years pressing down on her, forcing the moment into being. She'd made bread, because it was what she always did when she was anxious. Kneading dough was meditative, transformative. Flour and water and yeast and salt becoming something nourishing, something that could feed people, sustain them. She'd wanted to leave something good behind, even if it was just a loaf of bread. When she'd heard the knock at the door, she'd felt almost grateful. Finally, it was over. Looking at Detective Brennan's face, seeing the confusion and pain there, Zoe had understood that the detective already knew on some level that this arrest didn't make sense. That Zoe Mitchell, who'd lived 30 years in Ashford without a single suspicious moment, who'd been nothing but kind and helpful and good, couldn't possibly be a murderer. And that's why Zoe had asked to speak to her specifically, because Sarah Brennan, with her careful intelligence and her innate sense of justice, would understand.
would see past the evidence to the truth underneath, would help Zoe finally do what she should have done 18 years ago: tell the truth, face the consequences, and free them all from the prison she'd built. As she'd been led away, Zoe had looked at her house, her garden, her life, everything she'd built, and felt something unexpected: peace. The kind of peace that comes from finally, after years of running, stopping. From turning around and facing the thing that's been chasing you and saying, "Okay, I'm ready. Do what you have to do." She'd thought of a line from a Marioli poem she'd always loved. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" Zoe had used her life to protect her son, to try to atone for an unatonable sin, to plant gardens and feed people and make the world just a little bit better, even as she carried the knowledge that she'd helped destroy it in the first place. She'd used her one wild and precious life to live a lie so thorough, so complete, that even she sometimes forgot what was real. But now, finally, the lie was over, and whatever came next, prison, judgment, condemnation, at least it would be true. The news broke at 6 p.m., just in time for the evening broadcast. Tonight, a shocking development in the Amanda Chen cold case. Zoe Mitchell, a beloved community member and local volunteer, has been arrested in connection with the 2007 murder. Mitchell, 52, was taken into custody this afternoon following new DNA evidence. More at 11.
By 6:15 p.m., Ashford was on fire. Not literally, but digitally. Facebook groups exploded. The Ashford Community Forum crashed from too many simultaneous users. Text chains lit up phones across town. Within an hour, someone had started a hashtag Justice for Amanda. Within 2 hours, someone else had started a counter hashtag Free Zoe. The town, which had been united in grief for 18 years, suddenly found itself divided. Margaret Patterson, 73 years old, Zoe's next-door neighbor for 22 years, sat in her living room and wept. She'd called her daughter Catherine, who lived in Boston. "It can't be true," Margaret kept saying. "It can't be. I've known Zoe for 2 decades. She wouldn't hurt a fly. She helped me after your father died. She brought me meals for 3 months. She helped me replant my roses after the storm. Mom," Catherine's voice was gentle but firm. "The police arrested her. They must have evidence." "Evidence can be wrong," Margaret insisted. "DNA can be contaminated. I watch those crime shows. They make mistakes all the time." But even as she said it, Margaret felt a cold seed of doubt take root. She thought of all the times Zoe had seemed distant, distracted, the way she sometimes stared into space with an expression that could only be described as haunted. Margaret had always assumed it was grief over James, or the natural melancholy of a thoughtful person. Now she wondered. Across town, in a modest Cape Cod on Willow Street, Tom Reeves was having a very different conversation with his wife Linda. "I always thought there was something off about her," Tom said, pacing their kitchen. "Too perfect, you know? Nobody's that nice. Nobody volunteers that much, helps that many people without some kind of agenda." "Tom, that's not fair," Linda protested. "You're rewriting history. You loved Zoe. You said she made the best apple pie in Massachusetts. You said Daniel was a good kid who grew up right." "I was being polite," Tom snapped, though they both knew it was a lie. Linda recognized what was happening. Tom was retroactively finding evidence to support the conclusion he'd been handed, the way people always did. It was easier to believe you'd suspected someone all along than to admit you'd been completely fooled. "What about Daniel?" Linda asked quietly. "He teaches Megan a son. What are we supposed to think about that?" Tom stopped pacing. That was a complication he hadn't considered. Daniel Mitchell taught 3rd grade at Ashford Elementary. He was patient, creative, beloved by students and parents alike. If his mother was capable of murder, what did that mean about him?
At Sacred Grounds, Patricia Hayes locked the door at 9 p.m., 2 hours later than usual. The cafe had been packed all evening, everyone needing somewhere to go, someone to talk to, a place to process what felt unprocessable. She'd made more coffee in 6 hours than she usually did in a week. Now, alone in her cafe, Patricia sat at the counter and put her head in her hands. She'd known Zoe for 10 years, had considered her a friend, maybe even a confidant in some ways. They'd never talked about anything too personal. Zoe had always deflected, always kept the conversation focused on others. But Patricia had sensed a kindred spirit, someone else who carried wounds she didn't want to share. Patricia had trained as a minister. She'd studied theology, pastoral care, the nature of sin and redemption. She knew intellectually that good people could do terrible things, that humans were complicated, contradictory, capable of both profound kindness and shocking cruelty. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your bones were two different things. She thought about all the mornings Zoe had sat by the window, silent and sad. Had she been thinking about Amanda Chen? Had she been feeling guilt, remorse, anything approaching human emotion? Or was she thinking about groceries, the weather, what to plant in the spring? Patricia pulled out her phone and scrolled to Zoe's last text message, sent just 3 days ago. "Can we do coffee tomorrow morning? I need to talk to you about something important." Patricia had been busy and had suggested they wait till the weekend. Now she'd never know what Zoe had wanted to say. Unless... Patricia looked at the date. 3 days ago, right around when the news had broken about the DNA testing being complete. Had Zoe known? Had she been planning to confess? Patricia texted back, knowing she wouldn't get a response. "I'm here when you're ready to talk." The message showed as delivered, but not read. Zoe was in jail, her phone confiscated, her life effectively over. And Patricia had no idea how to feel about it.
At Ashford Elementary School, Principal Angela Morrison sat in her office late into the night, staring at Daniel Mitchell's personnel file. She'd called an emergency meeting with the superintendent and the school board president. They were set to meet at 7 a.m. to discuss what to do about Daniel. "He hasn't been charged with anything," Angela had pointed out during the initial phone call. "His mother has been charged with murder," Superintendent Richard Walsh countered. "Parents are already calling. They're scared. They want him removed from the classroom." "On what grounds? His mother's alleged crimes aren't his crimes." "On the grounds that we need to protect the children's emotional well-being," Walsh said, his voice hard. "And on the grounds that we can't afford a lawsuit if something happens." Angela wanted to argue more, but she understood the political reality. Fair or not, Daniel Mitchell's proximity to a murder charge made him radioactive. The school district would do what it always did: protect itself first, worry about individual rights later. She thought of Daniel, quiet, conscientious Daniel, who stayed late to help struggling students, who organized the school's annual book drive, who once spent his lunch break teaching a kid with autism how to tie his shoes using a patient, step-by-step method he'd researched and printed out. That Daniel Mitchell. Could his mother really have killed the teenage girl in cold blood? Could Daniel have grown up with a murderer and not known? Angela's phone buzzed. Another parent email. The 17th since 6 p.m. "Dear Principal Morrison, I am deeply disturbed to learn that my daughter is being taught by the son of a murderer. I demand his immediate removal from the classroom. If he is not removed, I will be withdrawing Emily from Ashford Elementary and will encourage other parents to do the same." Angela closed her laptop. This was going to be a long night. Claire Mitchell sat on the floor of Lily's nursery, holding her sleeping daughter and trying not to cry. Daniel was downstairs on the phone with Miriam Goldstein, trying to understand what was happening, trying to figure out what they should do. Claire had met Zoe 4 years ago, shortly after she and Daniel started dating. She'd been nervous. Meeting the mother was always a big step. But Zoe had made it easy. She'd been warm, welcoming, genuinely interested in Claire's life and work. They'd bonded over gardening, cooking, a shared love of mystery novels.
Zoe had helped plan the wedding, had thrown Claire a baby shower, and had been in the delivery room when Lily was born. Claire had loved Zoe, had thought of her as the mother she'd always wished she'd had. Her own mother was critical, distant, disappointed that Claire had become a teacher instead of a doctor. And now this. Claire tried to reconcile the woman she knew with the woman who'd allegedly murdered a teenager. It didn't fit. The pieces wouldn't connect no matter how she tried to force them. But what if it was true? What if the Zoe she loved was a fiction, a carefully constructed facade hiding something monstrous underneath? And what did that mean about Daniel? About their marriage? About Lily? Claire looked down at her daughter's perfect sleeping face. Lily had Zoe's nose, everyone said. Daniel's eyes, but Zoe's nose. Would people always see that now? Would they look at Lily and think about murder? Downstairs, she heard Daniel's voice rise in frustration. I don't care what the evidence says, she didn't do it. My mother is not a killer. Claire wanted to go to him, to comfort him, but she couldn't move. Because underneath Daniel's protest, she'd heard something else, something that sounded almost like fear. At the Ashford police station, Detective Sarah Brennan sat in her office reviewing the confession for the 100th time. She'd sent Marcus home hours ago. He had a family to get back to. But Sarah couldn't leave yet. The confession didn't sit right. Not because she didn't believe it. She did, mostly. But because it raised more questions than it answered. If Daniel Mitchell killed Amanda Chen at 14, where was the evidence? They'd investigated him, along with every other teenager who'd known Amanda. He had an alibi. His clothes had been examined. There'd been no blood, no DNA, nothing suspicious. His computer had been searched. There was nothing violent, nothing concerning beyond typical teenage browsing. Either Zoe was telling the truth, and she'd been thorough enough to erase every trace of evidence, or she was lying. But why would Zoe lie? Why confess to a cover-up if there was no crime to cover up? Why not just maintain her innocence, claim the DNA was contaminated, fight the charges?
Unless she was protecting someone. But who? Daniel seemed like the obvious answer, but Sarah had interviewed Daniel briefly before Zoe's confession. He'd seemed genuinely shocked, genuinely confused. Either he was an incredible actor, or he truly had no idea what his mother was about to say. Sarah pulled up Daniel's file on her computer. 14 years old in 2007, a student at Riverside Middle School, same school Amanda had attended before moving to the high school. Quiet kid, some bullying issues, mostly kept to himself. No criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. Clean as a whistle. Too clean. Sarah clicked through to his school records from that year. Decent grades, nothing spectacular. Missed 3 days of school in October 2007. October 15th, 16th, and 17th. The day after Amanda's murder and 2 days following. Reason for absence? Flu. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She pulled up the attendance records for the other students they'd investigated. None of them had missed school right after Amanda's death. Most had been there for the crisis counselors, the memorial assembly, the collective grief. But Daniel Mitchell had stayed home. She made a note to check the alibi more thoroughly. The friend who had supposedly been with Daniel, what was his name? Sarah flipped through the old case files until she found it. Tyler Brennan, no relation to Sarah. Tyler Brennan had been interviewed in 2007, had confirmed Daniel was at his house the evening Amanda died. But had anyone ever pressed him on the details? Had anyone checked whether Tyler might have been covering for his friend? Sarah looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Too late to call anyone now. But first thing in the morning, she was tracking down Tyler Brennan. Because something about this case still wasn't adding up. At 6:30 a.m. on November 13th, the protesters arrived. There were about 20 of them initially, standing outside the Ashford police station with signs. Justice for Amanda. How many more? Investigate MPD 18 years too late.
Leading them was a woman Sarah recognized from the case files, Jessica Chen, Amanda's older sister. Jessica had been 21 when Amanda died, away at college, devastated by the loss. She'd become a victims' rights advocate, working with families affected by unsolved murders, pushing for better DNA testing, more resources for cold case investigations. Sarah watched from her office window as a news van pulled up, then another. By 7 a.m., there were 3 news crews and 40 protesters. By 8 a.m., the number had doubled. Across town, a smaller group had gathered outside the county jail where Zoe was being held. These protesters held different signs: innocent until proven guilty. We stand with Zoe. DNA evidence can be wrong. Margaret Patterson was among them, holding a sign that read, "I know Zoe, she is not a killer." Next to her stood Luis Rodriguez, who'd worked with Zoe at the community garden for 8 years, and Father Michael Brennan from St. Catherine's, also no relation to Sarah, who'd known Zoe through her volunteer work with the church's food pantry. The town was fracturing in real time. At 6:30 a.m., Sarah finally tracked down Tyler Brennan. He was 32 now, living in Worcester, working as a systems analyst for a tech company. He agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near his office. Tyler was heavy-set, balding prematurely, with the resigned look of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for 18 years. "You want to know about Daniel," he said before Sarah even asked. "About that night?" "Yes." Tyler stared into his coffee. "He wasn't at my house. I lied. My mom lied too, though she didn't know she was lying. I told her Daniel had been there, and she believed me because why wouldn't she? We were best friends. He was at my house all the time." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Why did you lie?" "Because Daniel asked me to. He called me that night around 11 p.m. He was freaking out, crying, saying he'd done something terrible and he needed me to cover for him. He wouldn't tell me what. I assumed he'd gotten in a fight or vandalized something or, I don't know, typical teenager stuff. I never thought," Tyler's voice cracked, "I never thought it was murder." "When did you find out?" "Not until this week. When I saw the news about Zoe's arrest, I started putting it together. The timing, the way Daniel changed after that night." He took a deep breath and muttered, "He was never the same. He got quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped hanging out with anyone, even me. By high school, we barely talked. And I always wondered if whatever happened that night, whatever he did, if that's what broke him." Sarah leaned forward. "Tyler, I need you to make an official statement. Everything you just told me." "Will I get in trouble for lying back then?" "Probably. But you're 14. A judge might go easy on you." Sarah paused. "The question is, can you live with yourself if you don't tell the truth now?" Tyler closed his eyes. "I've been living with myself for 18 years. It hasn't been great." Armed with Tyler's statement, Sarah returned to the station and requested a warrant for Daniel Mitchell's arrest. Judge Patricia Connolly signed it at 2 p.m., her face grave. "This town is tearing itself apart," Judge Connolly said. "I hope you're sure about this, Detective." "I'm sure," Sarah lied. She wasn't sure about anything anymore. At 3:15 p.m., Sarah and Marcus pulled up to Daniel and Claire's house, a small craftsman bungalow on Oak Street with a cheerful yellow door and a garden that showed Zoe's influence. Daniel answered the door with Lily in his arms. "Mr. Mitchell, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the murder of Amanda Chen," Sarah said, hating every word. Daniel's face went white. "What? No, that's... My mom said she did it. She confessed." "Your mother confessed to covering up your involvement," Sarah said. "And we have new evidence that contradicts your alibi from 2007. "I don't understand." Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. Lily, sensing her father's distress, began to cry. Claire appeared behind him, taking Lily from his arms. Her face was a mask of shock and betrayal and something worse, recognition, as if some part of her had always known this moment would come. "I didn't," Daniel started, but Sarah was already reading him his rights.
As they led him to the car, neighbors emerged again. But this time the reactions were different. Angry. Afraid. Someone shouted, "Murderer!" A rock flew through the air, missing Marcus by inches. "Get him in the car," Marcus barked, and they did, leaving Claire standing in the doorway with Lily, both of them crying. At the station, they put Daniel in an interview room, the same one where his mother had confessed 18 hours earlier. Sarah let him sit for 30 minutes, standard procedure, time to let the anxiety build. Through the one-way glass, she watched him. He sat perfectly still, hands on the table, staring at nothing. When she finally entered the room, Miriam Goldstein was already there. "My client wishes to make a statement," Miriam said immediately. Sarah blinked. "Don't you want to consult with him first?" "We've consulted. He wants to talk." Sarah sat down, started the recording. "Daniel Mitchell, you've waived your right to remain silent." "Yes." Daniel's voice was steady, eerily calm. "I want to tell you what really happened on October 14th, 2007. Sarah glanced at Miriam, who nodded. "Go ahead," Sarah said. Daniel took a breath. "My mother's confession was both true and false. True in that she covered up a crime. False in that I'm not the one who committed it." He looked directly at Sarah. "My father killed Amanda Chen, and my mother helped him hide it." The room went silent. "Your father," Sarah repeated slowly. "James Mitchell, who died in 2013? "Yes." Sarah's mind raced. James Mitchell had never been a suspect. He'd been at work the day Amanda died. She'd checked his alibi herself when reviewing the old case files. He was a financial advisor, had been in his office in Boston until 7 p.m. that night, confirmed by multiple colleagues. "That's impossible," Sarah said. "Your father had a solid alibi." "For the daytime, yes. Amanda wasn't killed in the daytime. She was killed around 9 p.m. after she left the library. The medical examiner's report said time of death was between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. Sarah pulled out her phone, quickly accessing the old case files. Daniel was right. Amanda had been at the library until 8:30, confirmed by surveillance cameras and library staff. She'd left alone, walking towards home. Her body had been found 2 days later, and the ME had estimated death occurred within hours of her leaving the library. "Why would your father kill Amanda Chen?" Sarah asked. Daniel's hands was shaking now, the calm facade beginning to crack. "Because I told him what she said to me." The story that emerged over the next 2 hours was nothing like what Sarah had expected. Daniel had indeed been infatuated with Amanda, and yes, she'd agreed to help him with homework. She was a peer tutor, earned money that way. They'd arranged to meet at the library on October 14th, but when Daniel arrived, Amanda was cold, dismissive. She'd helped him with one problem, then said she had to go, that she had actual paying students to tutor. Daniel, desperate to keep her there, had said something stupid, something he'd regretted the moment it left his mouth. "I told her I loved her," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I told her I'd do anything for her, be anything she wanted, and she laughed. Not meanly, just she laughed and said I was sweet, but she was 18, about to graduate, heading to Juilliard next year. She said I was just a kid with a crush and I'd get over it." Daniel had gone home devastated, and he'd made the mistake of crying in front of his father. "My dad he had issues," Daniel said carefully. "He was controlling, paranoid, jealous. He'd been like that my whole life, but it got worse after his business partner screwed him over in 2006. He saw threats everywhere, conspiracies, people trying to take advantage of him, of us. Had asked Daniel what was wrong, and Daniel, stupid, heartbroken 14-year-old Daniel, had told him everything, including the fact that Amanda had laughed at him. He got this look, this cold, angry look I'd seen before when he thought someone had disrespected him. And he said, "Don't worry, son. I'll take care of it." Daniel didn't understand what that meant until 2 days later, when Amanda's body was found.
"I confronted him," Daniel said. "I asked him if he'd done something, and he told me. He was proud of it, Detective. He said no one disrespects his family. No one humiliates his son and gets away with it. He said he'd followed her from the library, caught up with her on the path through the woods, told her he wanted to talk about me, that he was concerned about me developing feelings for someone so much older. And when they were alone, when no one could see, Daniel couldn't continue. How did your mother find out? That same night, I was hysterical. I didn't know what to do. Mom came home from her shift at the hospital. She was a nurse then, working nights. She found me in my room and I told her everything. And then my dad came home, and we confronted him together. According to Daniel, James had been unrepentant. He'd cleaned up meticulously, showered, burned his clothes, disposed of the weapon in a way they'd never be able to trace. He'd been careful, calculating, and he told Zoe and Daniel that if they ever said a word, he'd kill them both. I believed him, Daniel said. My whole life I'd been afraid of my father, the way he'd get angry over nothing, the way he'd punish me for the smallest mistakes. I'd seen him throw my mother against a wall once over a burnt dinner. So yes, I believed he'd kill us if we talked. Sarah thought of Zoe, who'd seemed so composed, so controlled. She thought of James Mitchell, who by all public accounts had been a respected businessman, a pillar of the community. How much darkness could hide behind a respectable facade? Your mother covered for him, Sarah said. She did what she had to do to keep us alive, Daniel said fiercely. She protected me from a monster. And when that monster died of a heart attack in 2013, we both thought, we hoped it was finally over, that we could finally move on. Why didn't you come forward after he died? Daniel laughed bitterly. And say what? Sorry, my dead father killed Amanda Chen, but I didn't tell anyone for 6 years because I was scared. Who would believe that? What evidence was there? Dad had been so careful. There was nothing to tie him to the crime except our word, and our word was worthless because we'd lied for years. So your mother decided to take the fall, Sarah said slowly, understanding dawning. She did what she had to do to keep us alive, Daniel said fiercely. She protected me from a monster. And when that monster died of a heart attack in 2013, we both thought, we hoped it was finally over, that we could finally move on. But you're not the killer, Daniel said through his tears. I'm just the idiot kid who told his psychopath father that a girl had hurt his feelings. I'm the reason Amanda died. I'm the reason my mother's in jail. I'm the reason this whole town is tearing itself apart. But I didn't kill her. I swear to God, I didn't kill her. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. If Daniel was telling the truth, and every instinct she had said he was, then they had a dead killer, a mother in jail for protecting her son, and no real way to prove any of it. We need to verify this. Your mother's DNA at the scene. She went looking for the body, Daniel interrupted. After Dad told us what he'd done, she went to the woods to try and find Amanda, to see if there was any way to save her. But she was already dead. Mom touched her, checked for a pulse. That's probably how her DNA got there. It made sense. It made terrible, horrible sense. I need to talk to your mother.
And when he died? When he died, I felt nothing but relief. And then guilt over the relief. And then more guilt over not coming forward. But by then, what was the point? James was dead. Amanda was still dead. Nothing I said could change that. Sarah thought of the 18 years Zoe had carried this, the weight of it, the poison of it. She thought of Daniel, growing up in a house with a murderer, trying to be good, trying to make up for sins that weren't his. The DNA evidence, Sarah said. It matched you, not your husband. Because he's dead and cremated, so you couldn't test him. And because I was there. I touched her. I touched Amanda Chen's body when I went to find her, and I've regretted it every day since. She leaned forward. Detective, I'm not asking for mercy. I obstructed justice. I'm guilty of that. But my son, Daniel didn't do anything except be born to a monster. Please, please don't let this destroy him. Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. because she had no idea what to do next. The only witness to James Mitchell's crime was dead. The only evidence was the testimony of his wife and son, both of whom had lied for 18 years. Any defense attorney worth their salt would tear them apart on the stand. And meanwhile, the real killer, if Daniel and Zoe were telling the truth, had literally gotten away with murder by dying. Justice, Sarah thought, was supposed to be clear, black and white. But this was every shade of gray imaginable. By evening on November 13th, word of Daniel's arrest had spread. The protesters outside both the police station and county jail had grown to nearly 300 people combined. The national news had picked up the story. Mother and son arrested in decades-old murder. Both blame dead father. Inside the station, Chief Reynolds called Sarah into his office. "This is a disaster," he said bluntly. "The DA wants to charge them both, Zoe with murder, Daniel with accessory after the fact and obstruction, but our case is falling apart. The DNA evidence doesn't match their stories. Tyler Brennan's recantation of the alibi is compromised by his own admission of lying. We have no physical evidence linking James Mitchell to the crime because the man's been dead and cremated for 12 years. So, what do we do?" Sarah asked. "We follow the evidence, we build the best case we can, and we let a jury decide. But between you and me, Sarah, I don't think a jury's going to convict Zoe Mitchell of murder. Not when half the town is rallying around her, not when the only evidence is familial DNA that could have gotten there a dozen different ways. And Daniel? Daniel's a harder case. He had knowledge of a crime and didn't report it. That's a crime in itself. But he was 14 and allegedly terrified of his father. A good defense attorney, and Miriam Goldstein is the best, will argue duress, will paint him as a victim, not a perpetrator." Sarah thought of Amanda Chen, who'd never gotten to go to Juilliard, never gotten to become the violinist she dreamed of being. What about justice for Amanda? "I don't know," Reynolds said honestly. "I truly don't know." This haunting narrative spans 4 decades, chronicling how one murder reshaped an entire community and the lives connected to it. On October 14, 2007, 17-year-old Amanda Chen, a brilliant, kind-hearted violinist and National Merit Scholar, was murdered in Ashford, Massachusetts. Her body was found in the woods, strangled with defensive wounds under her fingernails. The case went cold for 18 years, becoming the town's most painful unsolved mystery. In November 2025, DNA evidence finally broke the case open, but not in the way anyone expected. Detective Sarah Brennan discovered that DNA at the crime scene matched Zoe Mitchell, a beloved 56-year-old community gardener known for her kindness and volunteer work. Zoe's arrest shattered the town. Neighbors couldn't reconcile the gentle woman they knew with a murderer. But the truth was far more complex. Zoe confessed to obstruction of justice, not murder. Her husband, James Mitchell, had killed Amanda. Zoe explained that her son Daniel, then 14, had developed a crush on Amanda, who had tutored him. When Daniel mentioned his feelings, James became enraged at what he saw as inappropriate attention toward his son. James confronted Amanda aggressively in the library, threatening her to stay away from Daniel. 2 days later, James followed Amanda into the woods and killed her. He returned home covered in blood, confessing to Zoe what he'd done. Terrified for herself and Daniel, Zoe helped dispose of evidence, burning James's bloody clothes and cleaning his car. James threatened to kill them both if they ever spoke. Zoe spent 18 years living with this secret, using volunteer work and community service as a form of silent penance. The case took another devastating turn when Zoe initially convinced Daniel he might have killed Amanda during a blackout caused by his medication, trying to protect him by taking the blame herself. Daniel, traumatized and confused, briefly believed her until memories surfaced of his father's confession and threats. When Daniel revealed the full truth, investigators faced a dilemma. The actual murderer, James Mitchell, had died in 2013. Amanda's sister Jessica provided the breakthrough.
She discovered Amanda's diary from 2007, which contained an entry describing James's threatening confrontation at the library, corroborating Daniel's account. Investigators then obtained DNA samples from James's cremated remains, which matched the DNA found under Amanda's fingernails. The evidence was conclusive. James Mitchell had murdered Amanda Chen. The district attorney dropped murder charges against Zoe and Daniel, but prosecuted them for obstruction of justice. Judge Patricia Connolly sentenced Zoe to 3 years in prison with parole eligibility after 18 months, acknowledging she was a domestic violence victim but also responsible for choices that denied Amanda's family justice for nearly 2 decades. Daniel, having been a juvenile during the crime, received 2 years probation and community service. Jessica Chen's response surprised many. At a press conference, she expressed understanding for Zoe and Daniel's impossible situation under James's control. She advocated for holding them accountable for obstruction while recognizing they were survivors of abuse, not murderers. Her compassion helped the community begin processing the complicated reality that good people can make terrible choices under duress. The aftermath rippled through decades. Ashford established 3 memorials to Amanda: a scholarship fund for young musicians, a memorial garden at her high school designed by her Aunt Lucy Chen, and an annual concert benefiting the scholarship. The community also confronted how they'd missed signs of James Mitchell's violence. He'd hidden his abusive nature behind respectability and social status. Zoe, released after serving 1 year, dedicated herself to domestic violence advocacy. She spoke at shelters and support groups, using her story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of staying in abusive relationships and the corrosive effects of silence. Her testimony directly influenced dozens of women to leave dangerous situations. The Amanda Chen Safe House opened in 2030, providing shelter and resources for domestic violence survivors, with Zoe instrumental in its planning. The process of forgiveness and understanding unfolded slowly. Lucy Chen, Amanda's aunt, struggled to reconcile having befriended Zoe at the community garden before knowing of her connection to Amanda's death. Grace and Bill Chen, Amanda's parents, eventually extended a form of grace to Daniel, recognizing he'd been a child trapped by his father's evil. Grace told Daniel that Amanda would have wanted compassion for those trying to survive impossible circumstances. Daniel rebuilt his life, marrying Claire and raising their daughter Lily, while developing community gardening programs and teaching workshops. He carried profound guilt but channeled it into meaningful work, honoring Amanda's memory through service. His Saturday workshops at the Memorial Garden became opportunities to teach children about growth and nurturing, work Amanda herself might have done had she lived. Lily Mitchell grew up aware of her family's complicated history. She became an acclaimed violinist, dedicating her performances to Amanda and eventually establishing a foundation for music education. At 29, she performed Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, the piece Amanda had been learning when she died, at Boston Symphony Hall, with Zoe, then 77 and failing, in attendance. Lily embodied the possibility of transformation across generations. The community's healing required embracing complexity. People learned that Zoe's kindness had been genuine, even as her silence was culpable, that victims and perpetrators aren't always easily distinguished, that fear can make cowards of good people, and that domestic violence often hides behind facades of normalcy. The case challenged binary thinking about guilt and innocence, forcing recognition that people contain multitudes, capable of profound kindness and serious moral failure. Over 40 years, Amanda's legacy evolved from tragedy into transformation. The Safe House helped over 300 women and children escape violence. The Scholarship Fund enabled aspiring musicians to pursue their dreams. The annual concerts became community touchstones. Most significantly, Ashford became a place that talked openly about domestic violence, that trained people to recognize warning signs, that supported survivors in leaving abusive situations. Detective Sarah Brennan, reflecting on the case throughout her career, recognized it taught her that justice is messier than satisfying endings suggest, that doing the work matters even when resolution is imperfect, and that understanding humanity's complexity is central to seeking truth. She acknowledged how assumptions about respectability had allowed James Mitchell's violence to go undetected. Zoe died in her late 70s, having spent her final decades in advocacy work that saved lives. She never claimed to have achieved redemption, only purpose. She learned to live with herself by acknowledging both her failures and her subsequent efforts to prevent others from making similar mistakes. Her transformation didn't erase her crime, but added dimension to understanding how people respond to trauma and fear. The narrative concludes 40 years after Amanda's death with a historical exhibition documenting the case's impact. Zoe Mitchell, now 64 and retiring from performing, reflected that healing doesn't mean forgetting or minimizing, but building something new from ruins, creating light despite darkness, and finding hope in horror's aftermath. She emphasized that good doesn't come from evil, but emerges when people respond to tragedy with courage, honesty, and commitment to change. Amanda Chen's death catalyzed lasting change. Not perfect justice, since the murderer escaped earthly punishment, but the justice of memory, legacy, and ongoing work to improve society.
The story illustrates that people are rarely simply heroes or villains, that circumstances profoundly shape choices, that silence protects perpetrators while compounding victims' suffering, that accountability and compassion can coexist, and that even from profound tragedy, communities can build meaningful responses that honor the dead by protecting the living. This haunting narrative spans 4 decades, chronicling how one murder reshaped an entire community and the lives connected to it, revealing how truth, justice, and redemption intersect in profoundly complicated ways. On October 14, 2007, 17-year-old Amanda Chen, a brilliant, kind-hearted violinist and National Merit Scholar, was murdered in Ashford, Massachusetts. Her body was found in the woods, strangled, with defensive wounds under her fingernails suggesting she'd fought her attacker. The case went cold for 18 years, becoming the town's most painful unsolved mystery, a wound that never healed, leaving Amanda's family without closure and the community living in the shadow of an unknown killer. In November 2025, advanced DNA technology finally broke the case open, but not in the way anyone expected. Detective Sarah Brennan discovered that familial DNA at the crime scene matched Zoe Mitchell, a beloved 56-year-old community gardener known throughout Ashford for her kindness, volunteer work, and dedication to beautifying the town. Zoe's arrest on November 12, 2025, shattered the community. Neighbors couldn't reconcile the gentlewoman who'd brought them meals when they were sick, who'd planted flowers in their yards, who'd built a fixture at the community garden for years, with a cold-blooded murderer. But the truth was far more complex than anyone imagined. Zoe confessed to obstruction of justice, not murder. Her husband, James Mitchell, had killed Amanda. The story Zoe revealed was one of terror, control, and impossible choices. Their son Daniel, then 14, had developed a crush on Amanda, who had tutored him occasionally. When Daniel innocently mentioned his feelings to his father, James became irrationally enraged at what he perceived as inappropriate attention toward his son from an older girl. James confronted Amanda aggressively in the public library, grabbing her arm and threatening her to stay away from Daniel, an encounter witnessed by the librarian and documented in Amanda's diary. 2 days later, James followed Amanda into the woods and strangled her. He returned home covered in blood and scratches, confessing to Zoe what he'd done in chilling detail. Terrified for herself and Daniel, knowing James's capacity for violence from years of abuse, Zoe helped dispose of evidence, burning James's bloody clothes in their fireplace and meticulously cleaning his car. James made explicit threats. If either Zoe or Daniel ever spoke about what happened, he would kill them both and make it look like an accident. For Zoe, trapped in an abusive marriage with a child to protect, silence seemed like the only path to survival. Zoe spent the next 18 years living with this unbearable secret. She threw herself into volunteer work and community service, creating the very community garden that would later bear Amanda's memorial. This wasn't mere performance, it was genuine penance, an attempt to atone for her silence by doing good in the world, by being the person she wished she'd had the courage to be. Yet every act of kindness was shadowed by the knowledge of what she'd helped conceal.
The case took another devastating turn when Zoe, upon arrest, initially convinced Daniel that he might have killed Amanda during a medication-induced blackout, trying to sacrifice herself by taking full blame while protecting her son from what she thought was his own guilt. Daniel, traumatized and confused, briefly believed this manufactured memory until fragments of the real truth surfaced. Memories of his father's confession, of being forced into the car to help dispose of evidence, of years of threats and nightmares. When Daniel finally revealed the complete truth to investigators, they faced an unprecedented dilemma. The actual murderer, James Mitchell, had died in a car accident in 2013, forever beyond the reach of justice. Amanda's sister Jessica provided the crucial breakthrough that validated Daniel's account. Searching through storage boxes, she discovered Amanda's diary from 2007, which contained a chilling entry from October 12 describing James Mitchell's threatening confrontation at the library. Amanda had written about feeling frightened by something dangerous in his eyes, and her decision to cancel future tutoring sessions with Daniel to avoid his crazy father. This contemporaneous documentation corroborated Daniel's story and established James's threatening behavior toward Amanda just 2 days before her murder. Investigators then pursued an unusual forensic avenue, obtaining DNA samples from James Mitchell's cremated remains. The crematorium had retained tissue samples, and testing revealed a definitive match with DNA found under Amanda's fingernails. The evidence was conclusive. James Mitchell had murdered Amanda Chen, and she had fought back, literally carrying evidence of her killer beneath her nails for 18 years. The district attorney dropped murder charges against Zoe and Daniel, but prosecuted them for obstruction of justice, a crime they had undeniably committed. Judge Patricia Connolly sentenced Zoe to 3 years in prison with parole eligibility after 18 months, delivering a nuanced judgment that acknowledged Zoe was a domestic violence victim living under constant threat, but also responsible for choices that denied Amanda's family justice and truth for nearly 2 decades. Daniel, having been a juvenile at the time of the crime and under extreme duress, received the more lenient sentence of 2 years probation, community service, and mandatory trauma counseling. Jessica Chen's response surprised many and helped guide the community's processing of these revelations. At a press conference, she expressed genuine understanding for the impossible situation Zoe and Daniel had faced under James's violent control, although she also forcefully advocated for holding them accountable for obstruction of justice.
The aftermath rippled through decades, transforming both individual lives and community structures. Ashford established 3 lasting memorials to Amanda, a scholarship fund for young musicians that grew to over $300,000, enabling full tuition awards for underprivileged students, a memorial garden at Riverside High School featuring a violin-shaped fountain, and an annual concert that became one of the town's signature cultural events, attracting hundreds of attendees and professional musicians who donated their talents. More significantly, the community confronted how they'd collectively missed signs of James Mitchell's violence. Former co-workers came forward, describing his explosive anger and threats. Neighbors recalled hearing screaming from the Mitchell home and seeing Zoe with unexplained injuries. The pattern had been there, but James' identity as a white, middle-class financial advisor who attended church and coached Little League had rendered him invisible as a potential abuser. This reckoning forced Ashford to examine assumptions about who perpetrators look like and how respectability can mask monstrosity. Zoe, released after serving 1 year due to exemplary behavior and early parole, dedicated the remainder of her life to domestic violence advocacy. She spoke at shelters and support groups throughout Massachusetts, using her story not to excuse her actions, but to illuminate the mechanisms of abuse, how violence coexists with respectability, how fear overrides moral judgment, how silence protects perpetrators while compounding suffering.
Her testimony was credited with directly influencing at least 47 women to leave dangerous situations. One woman, Renee, became the first resident of the Amanda Chen safe house when it opened in 2030, later becoming its director and crediting Zoe's honesty about cowardice with giving her courage to flee with her daughter. The Amanda Chen safe house represented the community's most concrete response to the tragedy. Established through combined county, state, and private funding, the renovated Victorian home could shelter up to 12 women and children, providing not just emergency housing, but comprehensive support, counseling, legal representation, job training, childcare, and transportation assistance. Zoe worked extensively with planners, advocating for services she'd needed but never had access to. In its first 15 years, the safe house served over 300 families, becoming a regional model for domestic violence intervention. The process of forgiveness and understanding unfolded gradually, painfully, without neat resolution. Lucy Chen, Amanda's aunt, struggled profoundly with having unknowingly befriended Zoe at the community garden, having spent hours planting flowers beside the mother of the boy whose father killed her niece. Yet Lucy ultimately chose to see Zoe's grief as genuine, recognizing that Zoe had also lost years to James's violence and control. Grace and Bill Chen, Amanda's parents who'd spent 18 years consumed by not knowing, eventually extended a remarkable grace to Daniel. Grace sought him out at a garden workshop to tell him explicitly that they didn't blame him, that he'd been a child whose innocent words were weaponized by an evil man, and that carrying guilt for his father's choices would dishonor Amanda's memory. Daniel rebuilt his life with deliberate intentionality, marrying Claire and raising their daughter Lily, while developing innovative community gardening programs that brought together children and elderly residents. His Saturday morning workshops at the Amanda Chen Memorial Teaching Garden became beloved community events where he taught hundreds of children about nurturing growth, work remarkably similar to Amanda's own passion for tutoring and helping others succeed. He carried profound guilt, but channeled it into service, understanding that the only path forward was creating the good that Amanda would have created had she lived. Zoe Mitchell grew up with full knowledge of her family's complicated history, neither sheltered from the truth nor defined by it. She became an acclaimed violinist, consciously dedicating every performance to Amanda's memory, and eventually establishing a foundation providing free music education to underprivileged children. At 29, she performed as guest soloist with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, playing Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, the piece Amanda was learning when she died. In a performance that brought her grandmother Zoe, then 77 and declining, to tears. Lily embodied the possibility of transformation across generations, proof that subsequent lives need not be destroyed by ancestral trauma. The community's healing required embracing profound complexity and rejecting simplistic narratives. People learned that Zoe's kindness had been absolutely genuine, even as her silence was culpable, that victims and perpetrators aren't always easily distinguished, that fear transforms moral decision-making in ways comfortable people can barely imagine, and that domestic violence flourishes precisely because it often hides behind facades of absolute normalcy and respectability. The case fundamentally challenged binary thinking about guilt and innocence, forcing recognition that humans contain multitudes, simultaneously capable of profound kindness and serious moral failure, of courage in some contexts and cowardice in others.
Detective Sarah Brennan, reflecting throughout her career on the case that defined her final working years, recognized it taught essential lessons about justice's messy reality. She learned that seeking truth matters, even when resolution proves imperfect, that the most dangerous perpetrators often seem least likely, that domestic violence requires systemic responses beyond individual prosecutions, and that understanding humanity's complexity is central to meaningful investigation. She acknowledged how her own assumptions about respectability had initially blinded her to considering James Mitchell as a suspect,
a humbling realization that informed her subsequent work and her post-retirement writing about criminal justice reform. Over 40 years, Amanda's legacy evolved from tragedy into genuine transformation. The Safe House helped over 300 women and children escape potentially deadly situations. The Scholarship Fund enabled aspiring musicians to pursue dreams Amanda never realized. The annual concerts became not just memorials, but celebrations of art's power to heal and connect. Most significantly, Ashford transformed from a community that had missed violence hiding in plain sight into one that trained residents to recognize warning signs, that provided robust support for survivors leaving abusive situations, that talked openly about domestic violence as a systemic issue requiring collective response. The narrative concludes 40 years after Amanda's death with an historical exhibition documenting the case's profound impact. Zoe Mitchell, now 64 and announcing her retirement from performing to focus on her education foundation, articulated what healing actually means, not forgetting or minimizing tragedy, but building something meaningful from ruins, creating light that exists despite darkness rather than because of it, and finding hope in horror's aftermath through sustained commitment to change. She emphasized that good doesn't emerge from evil itself, but from people who respond to tragedy with courage, honesty, and determination to prevent similar suffering. Amanda Chen never got justice in any traditional sense. Her murderer died years before being identified, escaping all earthly punishment and accountability. Yet her death catalyzed lasting, meaningful change that has protected countless others. This imperfect justice, the justice of memory, legacy, and ongoing work, represents perhaps the only resolution possible when conventional justice proves impossible. The story ultimately illustrates that people rarely fit neatly into categories of heroes or villains, that circumstances profoundly shape moral choices in ways that demand understanding alongside accountability, that silence invariably protects perpetrators while compounding victims' suffering, and that even from profound tragedy, communities can build responses that honor the dead by protecting the living and preventing future deaths.